Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and his overly moderate squish Republican allies reached an agreement with President Biden to increase the debt ceiling. Today, I'll explain exactly why it's a terrible deal that gives away everything and gets nothing meaningful in return. Then, Kari Lake continues her legal battle regarding her 2022 run for Arizona governor. I'll do a deep dive into the problems that plague the midterm elections in Arizona. If we are to have any chance at returning our country to its founding principles, we've got to stay focused on election integrity. Plus, a suburban Minnesota school district is flying the pride flag in all school buildings. Christie and Mike Pence prepare to officially announce their hopeless bids for the White House, and inflation has become so bad that many older Americans are being forced to come out of retirement. I'm Doug Wardlow, and this is Founding Principles.
It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
As you likely know, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden recently reached an agreement to lift the nation's debt ceiling. Here's the problem. It's a terrible deal for Republicans and an atrocious deal for America that sacrifices our conservative values and gives away the farm to the Democrats in return for absolutely nothing of any real value. Now, Speaker McCarthy and his cronies are running around touting the bill as the largest spending cut Congress has ever voted on. That may be technically true, but it's a bunch of nonsense. It's obfuscation. It's essentially a lie. The real truth is that Rhino-in-Chief McCarthy gave up everything and gained nothing in return. How do we know this? Well, look at who voted for and against the debt ceiling agreement bill in the House. The bill passed with the support of more Democrats than Republicans. 71 conservative Republicans stood up and voted against the bill. Only 46 Democrats voted against it. That right there tells you everything that you need to know. And now, many Democrats are gloating that they got one over on McCarthy and the Republicans. Well, that's because they did. So what did McCarthy and the Rhinos give up? Well, they gave President Biden unlimited suspension of the debt ceiling for the remainder of his presidency. That means that Republicans gave away all of their leverage for the rest of the time that Biden is in the White House. Going forward, they will have no leverage whatsoever because no matter how much money ends up getting borrowed and spent, Biden won't hit any kind of debt ceiling. What's more, when it comes time for appropriations bills, Republicans won't be able to push for deeper cuts, and they won't be able to push for any policy-related reforms. They will be stuck with the spending caps in the terrible deal. After all, McCarthy says these are the deepest spending cuts ever, so Republicans are not positioned to later argue for further reduced spending. But the fact of the matter is that these are not good budget caps, not at all. They cap non-defense spending for fiscal 2024 to about the same level as it was in fiscal 2023, and they allow for a 1% increase in non-defense spending for fiscal 2025. And there are no further budget caps after that. In other words, spending is not being cut in any real way. When McCarthy talks about spending cuts, he's only talking about reducing the expected spending increases by capping the increase to 1% in fiscal 2025. But with a $31 trillion federal debt, America desperately needs actual spending cuts. We got to actually reduce spending. Now, there are some spending cuts in the bill that go alongside the spending caps, but the actual cuts are relatively tiny. Indeed, according to Senator Mike Lee, the actual spending cuts in the bill amount to only $12 billion in the first year. So in the year that matters, this year, the year we have control over, the year where we could have gone ahead and forced a paradigm shift in terms of government spending, the Republican Rhino caucus under McCarthy chose not to do so. Instead, they just cut a mere $12 billion off the budget. It's a drop in the bucket. And with their spending caps, they have effectively locked in post-COVID spending levels as the new baseline for government spending going forward. Way to go, guys. But that's not all. There's much more not to like about this deal. For one, it doesn't include the REINS Act. The REINS Act would have required congressional approval for any agency regulation that would have a major economic impact, that is an impact of $100 million or more. That makes a lot of sense. It would have helped us get back to a place where our country is being run by our elected representatives and not by unelected bureaucrats, not by the deep state. But that provision was dropped. McCarthy is also touting welfare reforms in the bill. Specifically, the bill increases the work requirement age for adults receiving food stamps from 49 to 54-55. That sounds like a modest but good provision. But again, it's not. Due to other changes in the bill, the CBO estimates that it will actually increase the number of people on food stamps by 78,000. So it will create more government dependency. And how about the Green New Deal provisions that were included in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act? Well, McCarthy dropped his demand to repeal those too. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? I had truly hoped that McCarthy would stick to his guns. After all, House Republicans passed a bill that would have cut spending in a meaningful way. Indeed, it would have cut real spending by $1.2 trillion in the first year in exchange for a debt ceiling increase. They should have stood by that bill and demanded nothing less. After all, there is no real danger of default. There is plenty of money coming in for the government to make all the interest payments on the debt and fully fund defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and more going forward indefinitely. The only thing that might have happened, probably in July and not in June, was that we wouldn't have enough money to cover all those things, plus all the other discretionary spending. So there would have been a partial government shutdown. But again, it wouldn't have had any effect on defense, Social Security, Medicare, or even Medicaid. The United States was never in danger of defaulting on its debt. We were just facing the prospect of forced cuts in non-defense discretionary spending. That would have been far preferable to this terrible debt ceiling deal that gives away all of our leverage and locks in insane post-COVID spending levels as the new baseline going forward. McCarthy got played. Either that, or he's just part of the Uniparty and uninterested in any real reform. The bottom line is this: we can't really expect to save our country via politicians working at the federal level. We need Republicans at the federal level to step up and do everything possible to turn the tide of excessive growing government and the new corrupt censorship and surveillance state. But I don't expect that we'll ever be able to fully turn things around if we simply rely on Congress. And while we desperately need to retake the White House, even that won't likely be enough to stop the deep state. The real change that is needed to get our country back to its founding principles must occur through the states. We need red states to flex their muscles and stand up to the federal government. And we need a convention of the states to force the federal government to respect the original meaning of the Constitution, to force a balanced budget, and to force a return to real federalism. To do those things, we need to elect bold conservatives in state houses across the country. So, let's all recommit today to redoubling our efforts. Now we're going to do a deep dive into the issue of election integrity. Specifically, we need to take a close look at what's been going on in Arizona. Unfortunately, and I believe unjustly, Kari Lake's 2022 campaign for Arizona governor was handed a loss in court this week. After a 3-day trial focused solely on the issue of signature verification, the judge ruled that election officials had shown that they had made comparisons between mail-in ballot envelope signatures and voter record signatures as required by Arizona law. This ruling came despite the fact that a key witness for Lake's case put forward evidence showing that election workers spent on average only 3 seconds or less comparing 270,000 signatures. And of those, 70,000 signature comparisons were made in fewer than 2 seconds each. That's far too fast a pace to conduct meaningful signature comparisons, as I'll discuss shortly. But there were problems with Arizona's 2022 elections that went far beyond ballot signatures. Kari Lake said yesterday that she will file another appeal based on new evidence. Lake claims that she has video evidence in her possession that shows that Maricopa County conducted secret testing on tabulators over the course of 3 days in October after the legally required logic and accuracy tests had been performed on the voting machines. According to Lake, 260 out of 446 tabulators failed the tests, but were used on Election Day anyway. We should all be very grateful that the Lake campaign is continuing to fight for election integrity. No one can dispute the fact that Arizona's election system experienced massive problems on Election Day in 2022, problems that fully functioning, reliable, and fair election systems should never have. Trust in the elections process is a foundational pillar of any representative republic, and here in the United States, that pillar is cracking. During the 2022 midterms, the most serious issues experienced by the state of Arizona occurred with vote tabulators in its in-person voting centers on Election Day. And as we all know, Republicans tend to significantly outnumber Democrats in Election Day voting, while more Democrats vote before Election Day. According to the Maricopa County 2022 General Election Ballot on Demand Printer Investigation Report submitted by former Arizona Supreme Court Justice Ruth McGregor in April of 2023, quote, beginning almost immediately on the morning of the Election Day, the MCTEC Command Center received calls from poll workers reporting that some of the tabulators were not accepting ballots, close quote. The report mentions that they responded to calls from 70 centers. Maricopa County has 223 voting centers. The report began coming in almost immediately, the report says. In other words, the entire day of the election was marred with problems. Maricopa County Board of Supervisors Chairman Bill Gates confirmed the problems in a video he released Election Day morning. He said, quote, we've got about 20% of the locations out there where there's an issue with the tabulators, where some of the ballots, after people had voted them, they try to run them through the tabulator and they're not going through, close quote. Voters in Maricopa County cast over 1.56 million ballots out of the nearly 2.6 million ballots cast statewide. So 60.3% of all the ballots statewide in Arizona came from Maricopa County. Because 31% of voting centers in Maricopa County had major issues on Election Day, that means that nearly 20% of all the ballots in Arizona were potentially affected by those problems. Remember, the Arizona governor's race was decided by only around 17,000 votes. So what happened? Well, the report from the former Supreme Court Justice of Arizona talks about 100-pound paper weight and 20-inch versus 19-inch paper causing the printers to misprint ballots that could not be read by the tabulators. Essentially, the on-demand printers were overwhelmed and they failed. Many of the ballots that could not be read were thrown into a box and sent out to a central location to be counted later. The report gives a recommendation for next time. Quote, another approach is to eliminate the use of on-site tabulators. Maricopa County could return to its earlier practice, and that used in half of Arizona's counties, and transport the ballots from vote centers to the MCTEC for tabulation in the more powerful central count tabulators. Close quote. Okay, sounds good. Not a huge issue, right? Let's move on. Forget about this. Case closed. Well, that's what the media is saying, and that's what the left is saying. But what did this look like to voters in Arizona? Watch this from Anthem, Arizona, around 9:20 a.m. on Election Day.
So what happens is we have two tabulators. One of the tabulators is not working, okay? The other tabulator is taking about 75% successful. So 25% of them are being misread, and it could be a printer issue, or it could be the tabulator itself. So when it's misread, you have an option to put it into what's called box 3, and it gets read, whether it goes downtown and gets read manually, or whether it gets refed into our tabulator.
You don't want to adjudicate.
Get read.
No.
Okay? So no one's trying to deceive anyone.
Of course not. Not on election day. That would never happen, right? No, that would never happen.
So choices are, you guys. Sure.
If I get up there, you don't have to my ballot. Can I take my ballot with me and go somewhere else?
Sorry, there's not like you can go to some
I don't trust it going to box. The box may never be
No,
around.
no way.
choices.
I'll come back.
The choice is to wait until.
So do you think the lady who left the line came back? Did people in line trust that their ballot would be honestly counted if put into the box? By the way, the line and lines like them stretched out to 2 hours in some places. Did people wait? If not, did they come back later and try to vote? At 4:25 p.m., county election officials tweeted, quote, Maricopa County has identified the solution for the tabulation issues at about 60 vote centers. The solution has worked at 17 locations, and technicians deployed throughout the county are working to resolve this issue at the remaining locations, close quote. That was 4:25 p.m. The polls close at 7 p.m. in Arizona. Then at 4:53 p.m., Randy DeSoto of the Western Journal tweeted this video of an Anthem voting center from that afternoon. I mean, take a look at that line. It stretches on and on and on. And it goes around the building. It continues on. It's absolutely preposterous. Who would wait in that kind of line? It is so long, and that is burdensome, and it's essentially suppressing votes in Republican areas. Again, the polls close at 7 p.m., and that was at 4:53 p.m. when that video was taken. The line was still about a quarter mile long, even though the Western Journal wrote that the officials said that the issues were resolved. I wonder how many of those people actually voted. And again, Anthem is seen as a Republican stronghold. I wonder what the media reaction would be if Democrat-dominated areas experienced problems like these. Would there be outrage from the left? You bet there would be. But what about the people who worked in this election? What did they have to say? Well, thanks to reporting from the Federalist, we know. The Election Integrity Network sent a survey to its volunteers after Election Day to see how things went. This group trained over 50,000 poll workers, watchers, and the like. The responses from around the nation were okay and much better than 2020, with one huge exception: Maricopa County, Arizona. Executive Director of the Election Integrity Network, Marshall Yates, told the Federalist, quote, as soon as we sent the survey out, we were flooded with responses showing that they had no confidence in how the election had been run there. No confidence, none. Many poll workers in Maricopa County responded by saying that they had zero confidence in the election. Let's take a look at some of the comments from the survey submitted by those who worked the election. Quote, the printers were not properly calibrated, so the tabulators did not read the ballots and were rejected. Many voters left because of the delays and either did not vote or had to go to other vote centers to vote, close quote. Here's another one. Some voters did not want to place rejected ballots into misreads boxes. Some voting centers may have mixed tabulated ballots with misreads, close quote. And this next one pretty much sums it up. Quote, there was a horrible thing to experience. The poll workers conveyed a shocking lack of competence. It actually looked like willful incompetence, close quote. But according to Maricopa County officials and the legacy media, there's nothing to see here. Maricopa County Board of Supervisors Chairman Bill Gates reassured voters that in the event of difficulty, they could leave and cast their ballot at another voting center. But the checkout procedure led to more problems. The Arizona Attorney General's office said that many voters did not check out properly and were counted in the county's e-poll book system as having already voted. Well, how many of these people gave up and just didn't vote after being told that they had already voted? And then we have the signature verification issue. A group called We the People Arizona Alliance delivered a detailed presentation to the Arizona Senate in January of this year concerning this and the tabulator problems. In short, the 2020 election was marred with signature verification issues, and none of those problems had been fixed, so the 2022 election was impacted as well, as Kari Lake's attorneys recently demonstrated in court. In 2020, there were about 1.3 million mail-in or early person ballots that needed their signatures verified. The signature on the ballot envelope must be matched with the signature in the voter database to make sure the person voting is actually the person registered. There is a legal process for this, and as you might expect, a training manual created by the Secretary of State's office. Well, the Arizona Alliance team examined about 381,000 signature files from the 2020 election. The files were available thanks to an Arizona Senate subpoena of 2020 Maricopa County election data. Their signature verification team was trained in accordance with the Arizona Secretary of State Signature Verification Manual. After doing the math based on hours worked, number of workstations, and all that stuff, they determined that election workers verified all those 1.3 million signatures in just 8 to 13 seconds each. That's more than the 2 to 3 seconds spent verifying signatures in the 2022 election, but here's the problem. After actually doing the verification work, the Arizona Alliance team determined that you need about 30 to 45 seconds to properly verify the signatures according to the procedures outlined in the Secretary of State's training manual. I'm not sure if any of you have done any repetitive work, a job where you do the same thing over and over and over every few minutes or seconds. It's not for the faint of heart, especially when it goes on for hours and hours and hours. But for those of you who have, you know that focusing on that work without taking small mental breaks, even if just for a few seconds here and there, is not possible. A human being cannot remain 100% focused on any repetitive task for too long. There will inevitably be breaks. The mind demands it. You would need a team of people rotating through the workstation, 100% focus and work straight through for 19 days, 10 and a half hours per day, every 8 to 13 seconds, over and over and over, no breaks at all. We are not machines. There is no way that happened. Maybe if they had a couple months to do the work, they could do it. But they didn't have that much time. So here's what happened. 181,378 of the 380,976 signatures that Arizona Alliance analyzed failed to meet the standards in the training manual in 10 different ways. That's 47.6% of the signatures failing. Even if half of them were allowed to stand, that's a potentially massive swing in any election. Here are some examples of mismatched signatures. Please, look at this. They're not even close. Here's another one. This one didn't match during the election, but it matched later during another registration. Here's another example. This shows what appears to be multiple votes by one person. Terrible. And on and on and on it goes. So there is trouble, and it continued in the 2022 election as none of the signature verification issues from the 2020 election had been dealt with. But the judge in Kari Lake's recent trial just glossed over that evidence. Arizona Alliance provided their data to a qualified analyst, Dr. Walter Doherty, a senior lecturer emeritus in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Texas A&M, and a consultant for major national and international firms and government departments, including the Texas Department of Agriculture and U.S. Customs. He analyzed the Arizona Alliance work and many declarations of signature verification workers from the 2022 election using scientifically proven statistical projections to determine, with a 99.999% confidence level, that a total of 290,644 signatures failed to meet standards in the 2022 election. Again, the gubernatorial election was decided by about 17,000 votes, or a measly 6% of the failed signatures. This is a problem. There are solutions to this problem, but one side of the political spectrum wants nothing to do with anything that might even have a chance at cleaning up Arizona's elections. It's telling. And Maricopa County officials refused to cooperate with an audit of the election by state senators in 2020, dismissing all concerns about how it conducts its elections. Then, in 2022, it took the county very nearly 2 full weeks to count its ballots. It's completely unacceptable. This is troubling, especially when recent elections have been so close. In 2020, Joe Biden won Maricopa County by about 6,000 votes out of more than 2 million votes cast in the county. Statewide, he won by less than 12,000 votes out of over 3.3 million votes cast. The 2022 election was no different, as only 17,000 votes separated the gubernatorial candidates. Election integrity is a serious issue. It shouldn't matter what side of the political spectrum you are on. All should want fair elections. But in this country, the left doesn't even want to discuss election integrity. Just bringing it up results in attacks from every corner of the leftist world. Look, the 2022 election in Arizona was deeply flawed. There is no denying that. It just was. And in many ways, tabulator failures, insanely long lines, massive confusion about what to do, where to vote, how to vote, lack of trust everywhere, frustration everywhere. How do I properly check out from one failed polling place and go vote in another? What will happen to my vote if it ends up in the box or door 3? Were those ballots mixed with other ballots? How many signatures didn't match the records? How many mail-in ballots should have been cured? How many should have been rejected? How many people gave up and didn't vote? How many people were disenfranchised by the chaos itself? This is a model of how not to run an election. Regardless of political affiliation, everyone in charge of this election should have lost their jobs. Heck, if problems like these occurred during a foreign election that the United States was observing, our people would most definitely report that the election was a complete failure. It would not meet the standards we expect from nations trying to become functioning democracies, let alone the model for all representative republics. It's just truly disgusting. And the left wants nothing to do with fixing any of it. That tells you everything that you need to know, period. Election integrity is one of the most important issues of the day. Without free and fair elections, the entire concept of representative democracy ceases to exist. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson called the electoral franchise the, quote, ark of safety, that if properly guarded is the best protection of our constitutional order. Jefferson was correct, but we aren't properly guarding the electoral franchise. This is a huge problem for a couple of reasons. First, and obviously, we need to make sure the candidate who gets the most vote wins. That's how we make sure that the sovereign power is being exercised according to the will of the people. But there's a second reason, equally as important. You see, if people can't be confident that elections are putting the right people in office, then they can't be confident that the laws being passed or enforced by those people are being passed or enforced legitimately. And if people start questioning the legitimacy of the laws, then the question will naturally arise, well, why should we follow the law at all? So failing to properly safeguard elections is a path to lawlessness, chaos, and societal breakdown. And maybe that's the left's goal in all of this. But this much is certain. Conservatives nationwide need to take election integrity very seriously. We need to focus more on ensuring that the election mechanics at the precinct and county level are in order, that they are free and fair. This means more poll watchers and election judges, but it also means paying closer attention to county election officials. Take, for example, Maricopa County Recorder Stephen Ricker, a man directly connected to administering the 2022 election in Maricopa County. He was elected to a 4-year term in 2020. These positions are supposed to be nonpartisan. Listen to the recorder's responsibility from the website. Quote, the Maricopa County Recorder's Office is responsible for maintaining voter files for more than 2.6 million active registered voters in Maricopa County. The Recorder's Office partners with the Maricopa County Elections Department to plan and hold jurisdictional county, state, and federal level elections for all eligible Maricopa County voters, close quote. Well, that office obviously cannot be occupied by a partisan leftist. But listen to this from an October 2022 article in The Federalist regarding Mr. Richer. The article reports that, quote, Mr. Richer even set up a Democrat-funded political action committee to support Arizona candidates who share his views, a move strongly rejected as unethical by ethical election officials. The Republican National Committee and Republican Party of Arizona just sued him for packing polls with Democrat workers and seeking to bury the paper trail, close quote. Well, that's just what we need. There is no such thing as a completely unbiased human being, of course. They don't exist. Conservatives need to have a say in who runs our elections. Trying to elect people we know will be fair is of the utmost importance. 2024 is just around the corner. We cannot afford to let partisans and leftists run our elections again. We really do need to make America great again, and that starts all the way down at the county level. We might just have to take America back county by county. Oh, one more thing. Over in France, yeah, they vote in person with paper ballots and hand count every one, and they know the results that night or the next morning. The same is true in Taiwan. In Taiwan, they use hand-counted paper ballots because they are always concerned about the potential for communist China to meddle in Taiwanese elections. You know, maybe, just maybe, they are onto something. Well, if you like the content that we're providing, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like the video. If you're listening to the audio podcast, give us a 5-star rating. Doing each of those things helps us tremendously. Now, time for Behind the Headlines. First up today from Alpha News. Minnesota has now become the capital of insane woke nonsense. One of Minnesota's school districts has decided to really ramp up the indoctrination, doubling down on forcing LGBT garbage on its students. The suburban Osseo School District has decided to fly a pride flag in all school buildings for the month of June. Now, this isn't at all surprising because this is the same school district that said parents have a hard time predicting what gender their young kids will actually turn out to be. It's crazy. These people are teaching our children. It's beyond terrible. Now, as we're all very painfully aware, June is Pride Month, the holiest of all months in the leftist liturgical calendar. If a school district were to spread Christian messages during the holiest day of the church year, leftists would cry foul and rant and rave about the separation of church and state. It would be a national story that would inevitably end in a lawsuit by the ACLU. But LGBT activism? Well, that's the state-sponsored religion. It's the secular state's established church. According to the insane woke leftists, not only do they have a right to teach the state-sponsored LGBT religion in schools, but trying to shield your own kids from state indoctrination into this pagan religion is somehow a gross violation of other people's rights. Not sure how that works, because under their new state religion, everyone must celebrate all things LGBT. And if you don't, well, I guess you're a counter-revolutionary or something. It's backwards and stupid and terrible and a mockery of the Constitution's guarantees of free speech and free exercise of religion. But that's basically where we are right now. So what do we do about this? Well, homeschooling is one option that works for a lot of families. For decades, it was common in popular culture to mock homeschooling. It was seen as only for weirdos who have kids who aren't able to socialize. Well, what have we learned since then? The exact opposite is true. Nowadays, the children in public schools fall behind academically and are indoctrinated with leftist garbage, are addicted to phones, and unable to carry on face-to-face conversations. Homeschooled kids, on the other hand, are some of the best educated, most well-adjusted children out there. Now, of course, not everyone has the time or resources to homeschool, and not everyone can afford to send their kids to a private school. When possible, both of those things are good options. And that's why it's so important that we focus on passing school choice measures in every state across the nation. And meanwhile, we need to be vigilant about correcting the errors taught in public schools. So maintain good relationships with your kids, raise them in your faith, and work to guard against the lies that popular culture pushes. And be active in your local schools. Go to school board meetings and make sure your voice is heard. Pride Month is going to be annoying, that's for sure, but remember, the tide is turning, and we are starting to win the culture war. Second up today, are you ready? The biggest news of 2023 is here. Mike Pence and Christie are apparently both ready to announce their presidential bids. Exciting, I know. Almost as exciting as Asa Hutchinson, Nikki Haley, and Tim Scott. Several episodes ago, I spoke about how we have a deep bench of talent, while Democrats have basically nobody on their bench. Well, I feel as if an amendment is in order. Just because we have many good national candidates doesn't mean that every single Republican should run for president. In 2016, we had a couple very good candidates, led by President Trump, a couple of decent candidates, and then a whole lot of duds and rhinos and terrible candidates. I'm fine with a few candidates who can help us push our candidates toward the right, but let's hope we don't see a situation where we have 30 candidates, 28 of whom have zero chance of obtaining the nomination, jumping into the race. That wouldn't be good for the party or the country. Mike Pence and Christie have been in the news for the past couple of years because they complain about Trump, even as they attempt to take credit for all the good parts of his presidency. They don't stand a chance, and they really shouldn't enter the race. Our party is at a crossroads. We are in the middle of a realignment where the moderates and conservatives are battling it out for control. For the first time in probably 40 years, there are signs that we conservatives are winning that battle. We need patriots to get involved in the process and push our party in the right direction. We can continue to win political gains, but only if we stand up boldly for our conservative principles. Third and finally today, a new report shows that older Americans are being forced to come out of retirement because of inflation. Now, this is terrible and sad, so it's important to understand why this is happening. It's simple, actually. It's because Joe Biden is in the White House. Now, nobody with half a brain ever bought the Biden line that inflation wasn't his fault, but it was just some kind of product of COVID-19. Governors who chose to shut down their states and penalize business owners who stayed open, struggling to survive, well, those governors are indeed partly to blame, but the lion's share of the blame must fall squarely on the shoulders of radical leftists in Chief Joe Biden and the leftist in his administration. High taxes and the hidden tax of inflation, brought about by the deluge of government borrowing and spending and the massive expansion of the money supply, well, those things are crippling Americans. American dollars are worth less and everything is costing more. Indeed, American families lost on average over $10,000 of purchasing power last year alone, and nearly that much the year before. It's unprecedented. All this is obvious to anyone who takes a moment to reflect on the state of our nation. So why do so many Americans, nearly half of the voting population, still say they support Biden? Well, that's not an easy question to answer. A certain percentage of Americans have so bought into the leftist religion that they are perfectly willing to support Democrats to their own detriment. They've been brainwashed, and they are committed to their ideology to the point of willfully blinding themselves. Others are low information people who have no idea what's really going on in the country at all. These are the left's useful idiots, people who are sleepwalking through life, people who can name all the Kardashians but who would be hard-pressed to name even the sitting vice president. So the question arises, given the number of Americans who are either deep leftist ideologues or low information voters, is it even possible for reason and logic to win the day? Well, I believe it is possible. Eventually, and not too far in the future, we will hit a tipping point where Americans will be forced to accept the reality that the experiment of leftism has completely and utterly failed. It has poisoned our culture, destroyed our economy, and put the greatest country in history into a steep decline. To reclaim our country's greatness, we must rededicate ourselves to the ideals put forth in the Declaration of Independence. We must raise a generation that once again believes that America can be the shining city on a hill, that we can return to our founding principles and renew the blessings of freedom for future generations, that we can, and we must, and we will make America great again. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like the content that we're providing, please go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to the podcast, give us a 5-star rating. Doing all those things helps us tremendously, and it helps us grow the show and multiply its impact. And one more thing, remember, the CCP must be destroyed.